Good evening and welcome to the AOPA Air Safety Institute's webinar, The Mental Game, Managing Stress in and Out of the Cockpit. My name is John Collins and I am the Manager of Aviation Safety Programs for the AOPA Air Safety Institute. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please make sure you've muted your microphones. If you have any technical issues, we will not be able to troubleshoot them during the webinar. Audio issues can usually be solved by logging out and logging back in. We will take questions throughout the presentation and answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. Use the questions area on your PC laptop control panel, usually located on the right side of your screen, or the question mark at the top of the screen on your tablet or smartphone to submit those. There are two other co-organizers online with me tonight, and you may see them answering some questions too. Wings credit is available for tonight's webinar and will be submitted to your FAASafety.gov Wings account within 24 hours after the webinar. Also, a recording of this webinar will be available on the Air Safety Institute webpage, www.airsafetyinstitute.org. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Penny Levin. Penny is a practicing clinical psychologist, a professor of psychology at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a flight instructor, and the wing safety officer for the Pennsylvania Wing of Civil Air Patrol. She's also one of our ASI Flight Instructor Refresher Course presenters. Now, without further ado, Dr. Penny Levin.
Thank you so much, John. First, I'd like to say thank you to the Air Safety Institute for making this webinar possible, and to the ASI team for all of the help tonight. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope everyone is healthy and everyone is staying safe. As John said, I'm a clinical psychologist by trade. Basically what I do is I try to apply psychology to real life stressful situations like aviation and also patient safety. So we recognize that many of us right now are dealing with a lot of stress and uncertainty. And our hope is that tonight we can help you out with that a bit. That goes for managing life at the moment, but also as we think about getting back into our normal flying. So I always think it's important to think about what our goals are going to be when we do any kind of educational work. We're all living in different places in the country, and we're all having different levels of social distancing right now. Some of the states are in the process of reopening, and some of us are not doing that yet. Some of us have been very limited and have been sheltered in place for almost 2 months, and I know that there are those of you out there who haven't been. So I'm in the Northeast. I actually am outside of Philadelphia, and life has been very different here than it's been in the past, and frankly, we are not flying much. I understand that everyone's experiencing the current situation differently, and we expect that not everyone is going to react in the same way. We're all different people. So tonight, my main goal is to define stress differently, to help us all cope, not just with the pandemic, but moving forward, both in terms of life, but also in terms of our flying as it gets back to normal. And as we said in the description to the webinar, we're going to discuss a way of thinking about stress that generates solutions and not symptoms. We'll talk about some techniques for managing stress, but my main goal tonight is for all of you to come away with a very different way to think about the idea of stress, and then that may help you manage it differently. So we go to the doctor. The doctor often, if the doctor isn't sure what's going on with us, may say, I think the problem is stress. Do you have stress? My guess is that very few of us ever say, nah, no stress. Most of us say, of course I have stress. We talk about stress as this thing that exists. So I'm going to ask you to think about a hypothetical scenario, okay? You are at the circus. You hear the announcer say, and the lucky seat is Section N, row 102, seat 4. Come on down. You are today's lucky lion tamer. Into the cage you go. So now on a scale of 1 to 100, think about how much stress you'd experience. How stressful would that be for you? Probably for most of us, 100. When I do this with live presentations, most people are like, yep, 100. So here's scenario number 2. You're at the circus. You hear the announcer say, and the lucky seat is section N, row 102, seat 4. Come on down. Into the lion cage you go. You're today's lucky lion tamer. But you just finished the circus academy and you had a major in lion taming at the circus academy. So now on that same 1 to 100 scale, how much stress might you experience? It's not going to be a 1, there's a lion and you're still kind of new at this, but it wouldn't be 100. And the question is, why not? Because in the second scenario, you just happen to have exactly the skills you need to handle this exact situation that you're faced with. In this case, you're the qualified lion tamer. The way I say that is you've got resources to handle this particular stressor. Now, I'm going to put this into aviation terms as a second set of scenarios. You've got a non-pilot friend, and your non-pilot friend goes out with your buddy pilot for a flight. Your pilot buddy gets sick in the middle of the flight and can't fly the plane. On our 100-point scale, how stressful is that going to be for your friend who is not a pilot? Probably 100 again. So now, if you're a pilot, you're going to be out again with your pilot buddy on a flight, and she gets really sick and can't fly the plane. So going again to that 100-point scale, how stressful is that for you? My guess is that number depends on 2 things. Number 1, how comfortable are you flying this plane from the right seat? And number 2, how much medical knowledge do you have because you've got a sick friend in the plane? So basically, again, we're talking about what's the stressor and what's the resource. So when I say heretic, I say it because my opinion is that stress, as we think about stress, does not exist. As I said, we tend to think about it as this thing that exists in the world. We say we have a little stress, a lot of stress. I think the best way to think about it is that stress is the balance between the stressors that you face in life and the resources that you have available to cope with them. I was at an aviation conference a few years ago, and I met an amazing, incredible woman named Jessica Cox. Jessica was born with no arms. Jessica became the first person with no arms to earn a pilot certificate. And she also was the first armless person to earn a black belt in Taekwondo. So at the conference, Jessica invited people to come up and open a can of soda with their feet. And we're all pilots there, so everybody, all these people wanted to come up and try it. Nobody could do it. Jessica then came over, and within 30 seconds, that can of soda was open. We don't have the resources that Jessica has. She doesn't have the resources that we have. But the takeaway from meeting this extraordinary, incredible woman was that we can always develop resources to help us manage even the toughest stressors that we face in life. Jessica became a pilot. Now, that is not to say that people do not feel stressed. The acute stress reaction that we experience is very real. It's normal, and it's a reaction to a stressful situation or an emergency that we have. It could be an emergency in life, an emergency in the plane. Essentially, that reaction is what we think of as the fight or flight response. You're in your cave. There's a tiger at the mouth of the cave. You either need to fight the tiger or you need to run. Your body releases hormones. Your heart rate goes up. Your blood pressure goes up. You have energy in the form of glucose in your bloodstream, and that's what lets our bodies react properly in an emergency. That's what lets us cope with an urgent situation. So right now, a lot of us may feel out of control. Our futures might be uncertain, again, depending on where we're living in the country. There are different scenarios for opening up if we've been in a lockdown state. Some people are facing concerns like layoffs, kids being out of school. For us in the Northeast, even some of our everyday tasks, like groceries and, frankly, finding toilet paper, have become stressors. Where this becomes a problem, this stress reaction that we experience that helps us cope in an emergency, is if we have chronic stressors and we don't manage them. Then we have a chronic stress reaction, and that can impact our mind, our bodies. It can cause headaches, irritability, insomnia, high blood pressure, trouble concentrating. So when I say that stress does not exist, I mean that in the traditional way that we say, oh, do you have stress? I certainly don't mean that the stress reaction that we have physiologically doesn't exist, because it certainly does, and it can be very important. Right after 9/11, I was one of the people on the East Coast who was trained to manage what are called critical incidents as a psychologist. And I was up in New York for the week after that happened. And when I came back, I realized that the baseline level of difficulty, of problems, of stressors in the world impacts our ability to cope. So I sort of think about stressors in terms of baseline, external, and internal. Baseline stressors are things like world events, national events, or even things locally in your community. Right now, obviously, the COVID pandemic. But also there are communities that are impacted by mass shootings. There was obviously the huge economic recession in 2008. Right now, there's some economic uncertainty for many people. There can be unemployment or health issues. But baseline stressors exist outside of us in the world. They're not specific to us, and they're not in our control. So then there are what I think of as external stressors. These are things that are in your world. They could be job stress, job insecurity, issues with friends, issues with not seeing friends, potentially conflict when we do see them, things that we need to manage with clients, issues with family concerns, for students, school responsibilities, for parents, relationships with children, concerns sometimes about their health, finances, flight instructors certainly can become external stressors for those of us that have done flight training, and limits on our flying. Right now, for some people, some of the external stressors have to do with getting some supplies that we need, potentially getting medications, getting repairs done on the house or the plane, concerns with schools opening, concerns with working with if our kids are not in school, concerns with what parents may need. So those are external, but in our immediate world. Then I think about internal stressors. That's our personal characteristics, our personality that we have, for better and for worse. Do we tend to be anxious, a little depressed? Are we perfectionistic? Certainly that is a trait that many of us who are pilots do share. Do we tend to procrastinate? Do we tend to be disorganized? Do we have a physical illness? Do we expect too much from ourselves? Are you a workaholic? How do you talk to yourself? Like, the way we talk to ourselves is really important, and I'm going to speak about that in detail in a few minutes. Are we people who tend to doubt ourselves, either in life or as pilots? So what's been interesting recently for me is that I've always thought of myself as technologically impaired, and I had exactly 48 hours when all this began in my state to get both my work with my patients and the course I was teaching online. And that was a stressor that I had to build some resources for quickly. All right, so that brings us now to resources. So in the same way that there are different kinds of stressors, I think of different kinds of resources. There are external resources. These are things outside of us that we could use as tools to help us cope with stressors. Money, food, if we have a supportive family, supportive friends, for some people, a therapist or a counselor. There are books on stress management. There are gym memberships. If we want to help manage flight-related stressors, we have flight simulators. We have online aviation webinars. At the moment, with the situation with COVID, some external resources might be taking advantage of some funding that's available, learning to use technology for things that we tend to do in person. Something I have realized is that there are so many available online resources right now in almost any realm you can think of, including aviation, but not just in aviation. So next we move to internal resources. These are ways that we can improve our own personal ability to manage our own internal stressors and also the other stressors that we face in life. These can include, for some people, exercise, for some people, relaxation, nutrition, always helpful, for some people, even medication if it's something that's approved for flying, learning planning skills. Some people like meditation, yoga, sleep, self-help books. These are all ways that we can improve our own personal ability to manage our stressors. For people who are sheltered in place right now, learning to structure our day, finding creative ways to connect with other people, in particular other pilots, because that's important for us, doing some hangar flying, maybe watching webinars to keep our heads in aviation. So I do want to talk about one key mental skill. Okay, so in my field, we talk about mental skills. You know, the title of this was The Mental Game. So I'm going to talk for a minute about mental skills. How we talk to ourselves is so important. There's something in my field in psychology that we call cognitive coping skills. And to understand them, first we have to think about some of the ways that we sometimes distort our ideas. So for example, you walk out on the ramp at the airport and a friend looks up, looks down, ignores you, and keeps walking. Now, you might think to yourself, man, what is wrong with him? That was really rude. Geez, I would never treat him that way. If that's what you said to yourself, you would probably be irritated, annoyed, even potentially angry. On the other hand, same exact scenario. You walk out on the ramp, a friend, a fellow pilot, walks by, looks up, looks down, and keeps walking. But instead, this time you say to yourself, geez, I wonder if he's okay. That's not like him. Usually he's, really friendly. We're friends, and I hope everybody in the family is okay. I'm wondering, is everything all right? If that's what you said to yourself, obviously, you'd feel concerned. So the external situation is exactly the same. The difference is, what did I say to myself about it? So there are some specific ways that we tend to talk to ourselves that can be a problem. So let's kind of use the example of, I'm back to my normal flying, some crosswind, and I did a landing that just was not good. So I might say to myself, oh, that landing was my worst. It was just terrible. It was just awful. Okay. That's an example of all or nothing thinking. It's not nuanced. I didn't think about maybe there were good and bad points in my landing. It was just all bad. I might catastrophize. I might say to myself, I can't land the plane anymore. I had this time off and now I can't do it. So that's an example of really focusing on the negative and seeing the situation as a catastrophe. You might overgeneralize. You might say to yourself, oh, God, that landing was so terrible. I'm a terrible pilot. I'm really not good at this at all. Overgeneralizing from this one bad landing to yourself as a pilot. You might predict the future or do what we call fortune telling and say to yourself, I'm never going to get it right. I'm sure I had it, but I've been off too long. I'm just never going to get it right. Predicting the future when we really don't know what the future obviously is going to hold. So in the same way that we have distortions, we can also think about how can we combat those. So sticking with our example of the crosswind landing, the first thing to do is to become aware of how you talk to yourself. Notice if you're criticizing yourself. If you find yourself getting upset, for example, after a bad landing, notice what you say. Are you saying things like, wow, that was awful, I'll never nail it, I'll never get it right? And then ask yourself if you're being too harsh in how you're evaluating yourself and your behavior. Is there a reasonable, realistic way that you can talk about this event to yourself? Well, maybe this one didn't work out and I'm out of practice at the moment and I really didn't set up my stabilized approach soon enough. Okay. And we also can remember our positive performances in the same area. Well, today wasn't my best crosswind landing, but I'm sure that once I get back flying more, I'll be able to do as well as I have in the past. So this is just a thumbnail version of how important it is to think about how it is that we talk to ourselves. So we're going to talk about each of these areas in some detail, but these are the four basic, one way of looking at the four basic components of coping with stress. There are lots and lots of ways to parse this, but this is just the one I'm going to talk about tonight. Any kind of coping with stress is going to start with a realistic self-assessment. Okay, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses, both in life and, as we're talking about tonight, as a pilot? When we do the flight instructor refresher courses, one of the things that I talk about with CFIs is to suggest that we have personal minimums. And when we have those, we think about our strengths and our weaknesses for a particular time and under particular conditions, regardless of how experienced we are. In my opinion, even the most experienced pilot needs to have personal minimums. We all have things we can and cannot manage. And the people I know who have had devastating accidents and incidents are people who did not recognize that even the best pilot needs to have clear personal minimums. If you have trouble doing this for yourself, something to ask yourself might be, well, what would people who know me say about this? Now, as we start to talk about some of these different areas, bear in mind, no one size fits all, okay? I'll suggest some ideas, and some of them you'll think, yeah, that sounds great for me. And some of them you'll think, nah, not so much. So just bear in mind that no one of these is going to be right for everybody. Communication. As humans, we all need to be in contact with people, and we all need to feel understood. Sharing our feelings and having other people just listen helps us feel understood. And for example, a feeling, say you're a flight student, that you might share is you may be worried about how it's going to be when you get back in the plane. If that's something that you're thinking about's worrying you, that might be something to share with somebody you can trust. Likewise, we can also help other people feel understood by just listening to them. And that will help them feel closer to us and us feel closer to them. And often we find out that the things that we're concerned about, other people are worried about as well. We can, if we're working to communicate better, say what we think the other person is trying to express. So for example, you can say, sounds like you're thinking about that when you think about getting back in the plane for lessons again, it's got you really worried. Okay, if you're wrong and that's what you reflect back to your friend, you're wrong, they'll clarify it. They'll say, no, really, this is what I'm having more trouble with. And they'll still feel understood. As pilots, we want to solve problems. We want to give advice and we want to solve problems. The only thing I can say is that often people just need to be listened to, and we don't always have to solve problems. So, I do want to say that there are things right now that are just a bit more difficult, other than just organizing, even in the current situation. And I want to say a word about creative approaches to some of the things that we're facing. My synagogue has had Zoom services. A good friend of mine goes to religious services at her church virtually every week. We've been having virtual club meetings for the flying club. We've had virtual meals. So many things we have to be creative with right now. In addition, we have to be creative with keeping ourselves organized under the current situation. In my field, something we talk about is mastery and pleasure. Mastery and pleasure are really important in terms of improving happiness and helping have us not become depressed. So, mastery is accomplishment, and pleasure is pleasure. The question is, under the current situation, how can you think about things that you accomplish and things that you enjoy every day and every week? What gives you a sense of accomplishment if you don't have access necessarily as much as you'd like to some of the things that you usually would have for that? If you're not working at the moment, how might you feel like you're achieving enough? Is this the time to go do some work on the plane? I don't know about you, but I have never met a hangar that couldn't be cleaned up a little. Is this the time to prepare for a written test or think about a new rating? Gardening. There are many things that we can do to have a sense of accomplishment, and also things that we can enjoy. Structure helps most people feel in control. To the extent that we can try to plan what our day and our week will look like, that will help give us a sense of control when we have so much that we don't know about the future. And most of us are calmer when we're organized and know what we can expect day to day. Okay, which brings us to planning. Not everybody likes to plan. Some people really do prefer to wing it. But if you're going to be planning day to day, week to week, please be sure to try to include activities that will bring you a sense of the mastery and pleasure we just talked about. Be sure to include aviation-related activities. Even if you're not flying normally, we are all still pilots, and that's an important part of us to attend to. Any tools that can help, we can use. Think about what we can look forward to, short-term and long-term. Like I think in my week about what are the days that are going to be nice so that I can get out to the park and hike even. Start to have a plan for returning to more normal flying. Articulate it, maybe even write it down so you can really follow it. If you're a student, are virtual ground lessons possible? Should you be studying for a written? What can you be learning or working on to help keep your head in flying? Is this the time for some serious simulator time, or maybe to take a look at what the new changes are on your foreflight? Is this the time to work on a wings phase? You've already got one piece of credit tonight with this webinar. In crew resource management, we always say use available resources. Use all your available resources. ASI and AOPA have an incredible range of online resources just there to be taken advantage of. Self-care. So this is certainly the area where no one size fits all. I will say a word about diet and exercise. Diet and exercise are very important. This is what the data says, and this is what most of us find to be true. So, exercise. Our golf clubs opened today in Pennsylvania. Again, I have no idea around the country what you do and don't have available, but for many of us, gyms, golf clubs, tennis courts, and other kinds of resources have been closed, and we have had to get to be pretty creative. I've been doing some online exercise classes, which I found to be great, and lots of hiking. We've put a few pieces of small pieces of equipment in our basement, and we're working out. Exercise reduces physical symptoms of what we're thinking of as a stress reaction. Exercise can help reduce anxiety and depression. It can help prevent heart disease and diabetes. And you only need 30 minutes a day to make a difference. If you don't exercise regularly, it's really important to start out slowly. And it's important to know that you don't need a gym. Lots of things we do around the house are exercise. Painting, not in terms of like painting a picture, but painting your house, painting rooms in your house, washing the car, washing the plane, vacuuming, yard work. All these things are exercise. The thing to think about is, what do I enjoy? If you don't enjoy it, you're not going to stick with it. And I just want to say a word or two about sleep also. Sleep is really important. One of the best things you can do if you have trouble sleeping is to have some kind of a routine that you use at the end of the day that helps you wind down and be prepared to sleep. You want your room dark and quiet. Typically, people sleep better if the room is slightly cool. Make sure your bed and your pillow are comfortable. And the one that people hate is no screens before bed. That is one of the ones that is helpful for sleep hygiene, but nobody really likes to shut them off. And then the last thing is, at night, to consider limiting news exposure if you need to and you find it upsets you. Okay, cockpit stress management. Now, as you can tell from everything we've been talking about, most of what I've been saying can absolutely be applied to our flying. We will all fly normally again. Many of us will be rusty pilots. It's important now to have a reentry strategy, some way to re-enter your normal flying that's right for you. Is it going to be pattern work? Is it going to be a flight with a buddy pilot? Is it going to be a flight with a CFI? Think about what your best reentry to more normal flying is going to be. I want to talk about, just for a minute, proficiency. Be sure to account for lack of proficiency if that's going to be an issue for you. Just because you could fly a particular plane really comfortably when you were flying more doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be as comfortable when you go back to more normal flying. Include in your planning for proficiency your electronic flight bag, your iPad, whatever your particular variant of that is, and returning to your proficiency with the glass cockpit if you fly one. Proficiency with the technology impacts safety and it erodes very quickly. Think about practicing now with simulator for your display. Practice now with your iPad so that when you get back into more normal flying, you'll be as comfortable with it as you were. So I'm going to talk about one more sort of psychology type idea, and that's something called a habitual behavior pattern. And what that means is that when we're in a familiar situation, we have a habitual way of acting. We do what we've always done in that situation. We get to the table for a meal, we start to salivate because we eat at the table. When we get into an aircraft, we pull out a checklist because that's what we do. This is really adaptive and it frees up our minds for more important new information that comes along. But it does have a caveat right now, and I want to say a word about screens. When it comes to these habitual behavior patterns, screens present a particular challenge. Under the best of conditions, when we are in front of a screen, we stare at it. That's just what most tasks on a screen require. Right now, many of us are doing even more of that because of other limitations. Because of this, we've had issues with distracted driving and even people who get into walking accidents because of staring at a screen. And the same thing can be true with our flying. The difference is that in the plane, there are real life implications for what's on the screen. There was a situation once where I was doing some training with some other pilots, and I happened to be in the back seat, and it was a glass cockpit, and two very proficient pilots were both pointing at the screen. This was sort of in the earlier days, at the traffic. And I remember sitting there and thinking to myself, yes, the traffic's on the screen, but the traffic also is outside of the airplane. And it's very, very easy when we're so used to looking at screens and thinking that all of our information is on the screen. It's so important to remind ourselves in the plane that we cannot do that. We have to remember that it's a representation of what is outside and has real life implications for us. So, the key takeaways. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight and joining us, and I hope you all enjoyed the webinar. I hope you learned something that you can use going forward, both in and out of the airplane. I know we covered a lot, and not everything I talked about is going to work for everybody. You need to think about what are the best resources that will work for you. So again, when we first started, I said I wanted the key takeaway to be that I want you to have a way to think about stress that allows you to say, what is the stressor and what are the resources that I can bring to bear on this situation to manage it? If Jessica Cox can learn to fly an airplane, every one of us can learn to manage stressors that we have in our lives. We may not be able to control the world around us, but we certainly can work toward learning to control our own reactions to the world. And back to John for questions and answers.
Okay, thank you, Penny. That was a great webinar. Excellent topic. We do have several questions, so let's get to those. The first one, this is, I think, more of a comment than a question, although you may care to weigh in on it. Internal stressors for a perfectionist, i.e. a workaholic CFI, equals a prime therapy candidate. Do you agree or disagree?
Goodness, that's going to take a minute or two to unpack, but what I would say about it is There are people who come to me for therapy because it's apparent in my online presence that I am also a pilot. Often pilots are looking for someone who understand them as well, who can understand them as pilots. So for whoever had that comment or question, I would say possibly if it's distressing you, but make sure you find someone who understands you.
Okay. The next question we have, another kind of a scenario here. One of the stressors I have is when taking off in an urban area or flying over an urban area in a single engine plane. That thought of going down and having nowhere to land can be very stressful. How would you suggest we face this type of fear?
Wow. Um, it is actually interesting. We pretty much lost the engine on what would have been my first solo. So actually, I did have something somewhat similar to that experience. Luckily, it was just before my first solo, and my CFI managed the situation for me. But I know how scary that is, and I think that my advice to this person would be planning. Before you take off, always know where you would go if you lose the engine. And if wherever you're taking, if that's not an option, I think potentially it would be a good question to ask, is that a safe takeoff? Because you can lose an engine, and there needs to be a practiced, pre-planned, doable strategy if that happens.
Okay, thank you. Another really good question here. Another scenario. A pilot on final. The approach is going pretty well. Conditions start to go bad though, and the pilot loses personal control. Suddenly says, "I can't do this. You take it." Becomes very upset. Doesn't want to continue to fly. How would you deal with that immediate situation? This person actually has pretty good ability when things are under control, but has great difficulty dealing with any problem with the airplane.
So I'm assuming that, and correct me if I'm wrong on this then, that this question comes from the pilot who has the difficulty?
That I don't know.
Okay. I will assume that that's the case. So there are many things that we can practice in an airplane. This is not among them. This is the sort of thing that we need to think through on the ground to essentially go through the scenario in your head, either individually or if you're a student with your instructor, and try to slow down that movie in your mind. Because often things that are automatic reactions like that happen very quickly. And we need to be able to slow down that thought process. And the best way to do it is to, on the ground, literally shut your eyes, imagine what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, and then notice those reactions and try to slow down what is the sequence of thoughts that you're having that lead to the panic.
Okay. What would you recommend? And this question actually came from the CFI. He just gave me that advice there. What would you recommend for the CFI in that situation? How can he help his student?
By number one, normalizing it for the student, I would say, not having the student feel upset or ashamed by the reaction. This is, I assume, not the first student to have this sort of situation, but obviously gets in the way of training. So this is the time on the ground for a good conversation. Let's think about what happens. And you can encourage the student to do what I just suggested on their own, but also go through that in a non-judgmental, matter-of-fact way. Well, let's sort of go through the process together and see what it is that's going through your mind.
Okay. All right. Some other questions have come in, and this is a good one here. What tools do you recommend to remind us of making sure we have positive conversations with ourselves and keeping a positive mental attitude?
Wow, that's a whole new webinar. Um,
We can do that.
yes, that is a whole new webinar. Could you just actually repeat the specifics of that question for me one more time?
Sure. Our attendees looking for tools that you recommend to remind us of making sure we keep a positive conversation with ourselves. How can we keep that positive conversation going when we want to have a negative one, and thereby keeping that positive mental attitude or outlook on what's going on?
So, in the same way that when I first started lifting weights, I couldn't lift that much, and haven't been at the gym obviously in several weeks now because they've been shut, but I could lift some pretty heavy weights um, after working at it for some time. This is also an exercise that needs to be done regularly in order to build strength and ability in it. I think, there are certainly some resources, and I do wish I could say off the top of my head a great book on this, but there isn't sort of one specific way to say, yes, this is the key. The specific kinds of distortions that I talked about are some of the ones that we can look for. David Burns is an author who has written some good accessible material on what we call the cognitive distortions and ways to cope with them. So that's an author potentially I might recommend, but there really isn't one specific way to do this. It's a matter of becoming aware of our self-talk. Writing it down really helps, and then evaluating those thoughts and saying, am I catastrophizing? Am I fortune telling and imagining something bad in the future? And those are ways to then allow us to state those same concerns in a more neutral or positive way. And there also are some things that help us in general be happier in life. And one of those is actually the practice of gratitude, which is to sit down on a very regular basis, for example, before going to bed at night, and say, this is what I was grateful for today. And that's more generally a way to improve happiness.
Okay. Oh, we have a lot of good questions coming in here. Let me come down here a little bit and select some here. What are some effects of positive stress, and how can they affect flying safely?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Um, I mean, positive events can be stressful as well as negative events, but I'm not sure I actually understand exactly how to respond to that. I'm not sure exactly what the person's asking. So potentially if they could clarify that before we end.
Okay. All right. Diego, if you can weigh back in with that, that'd be great. Get a little clarification there. In the meantime, let's take another one here. What techniques can you apply to respond to a stressful situation, as an example, an emergency, when fight or flight symptoms manifest themselves but need to be resolved rapidly so that you reduce mental workload and focus on the task at hand?
Okay, this is why we practice emergencies. I'm going to say that again. This is why we practice emergencies with our students as instructors. This is something that I can recall as a flight student I did not particularly enjoy. However, having been in a couple of difficult situations myself, I can tell you, you want to be able to fall back on your training is point number one. Point number 2 is to have a way of dealing with those thoughts that you practice in advance and is essentially a part of your thinking in an emergency, which is whatever the scary thought is, some variant of flush it, what's next? What do I need to do? Fly the plane. So I think it's a combination of a few different things. The flush it image, apparently somebody told me, came from a Major League Baseball team that used to have a little toy commode at the end of the bench. And when someone came back from a bad at bat, they would apparently flush the tiny little handle, meaning put it behind you. What's next? What do I need to do? So I think there are a few things. Number 1 is practice, practice, practice. Number 2 is be as far ahead of the airplane and the flight as you possibly can, meaning also that you then have more time available to be scanning the situation to see a problem before it develops or when it's beginning to develop, and to know your airplane. So there's sort of a range of different possibilities.
I would also add to that, and this is something that I teach my students, brief the takeoff, brief your emergency plan right before you pull out onto the runway, or call the tower to tell them you're ready to go. Go all the way through that. I'm on runway 26. My abort point is at this point down the runway. If there's something wrong on the takeoff, etc., and all the way through to the departure, I will turn back if I am above a certain altitude or I'm going to land wherever. Hopefully you have done a little work ahead of time, particularly if you're at an unfamiliar airport, to take a look at maybe Google or some other photograph that you can figure out where am I going to go in the event I have an engine failure. So just something there that you can take to look. Clarifying the positive stress
thank you.
question.
First of all, before you do that, thank you very much for adding that.
Sure. Let me get back to here. Here we go. For the positive stress question, I think at some point, stress increases performance to actually a positive level. Then it gets too much and performance begins to degrade. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
That is absolutely accurate. A certain amount of anxiety does enhance performance, and a good deal of anxiety then begins to decrease performance. Where that line is for any individual is very difficult for anyone to predict.
Okay. Okay, here's a good question, and this may be I like this. Can you talk about how having too much of a resource may cause stress, like having too much time or having too much help?
There are two different areas, too much time and too much help. And I'm, again, not sure the exact context for this particular question, but I'm assuming that is in a flight. So I don't know that there is such a thing as too much help, from the standpoint that we can never have too many resources. If by help we mean somebody telling us what to do, that's a very different point, because obviously as pilots, or if this is from a student, we want to be independent, we want to be able to manage the situation ourselves, we want to have that confidence. So too much help can actually get us questioning our own capabilities. Too much time, the only time that strikes me that it could be a problem in a flight is if we are on a long cross country on autopilot and let ourselves get complacent and not stay on top of monitoring the plane and the flight.
Okay. Let's see, we have some good comments here about staying in the moment, also remembering to use the I'm safe acronym and helping to reduce stress, and a quote of sorts from Chuck Yeager, who once said, "If I had 10 seconds to solve an emergency situation, I would think for 9 and then act."
I love that. That's great.
Yeah, that's a good one. All right, it looks like we've got just about all the questions answered. I don't see anything else that we haven't covered in some way. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you again to Penny. It was an absolutely fantastic webinar. A lot of good points there, stuff that I'm going to use myself and stuff that I hope our audience will be able to use. I want to say thank you to all of you who attended tonight's webinar. We'll be doing this again next month. We'll present Preparing for the Worst, Pre-Flight Survival Tips from a Combat Search and Rescue Pilot. That will occur on May 28th at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. And remember, if you should see some Wings credit in your Wings account at FAAsafety.gov. If you don't see that, please send an email in to us at the AOPA Air Safety Institute. We will be happy to make that happen for you. So from all of us at the Air Safety Institute, we'd like to say thank you, good night, and fly safe.